Hello there and welcome to a revision session which will be recapping the key structures needed for your paper 3 Edexcel exam. So for option 31, Weimar Nazi Germany 1918 to 1939. So in terms of this session, I'll be thinking about how we approach the key questions on the exam. In particular, there'll be a big focus on the 16-mark interpretation question, and then at the end, in fact I might do it now, there's a suggestion on how to approach the exam if you're struggling for timing. So in fact I'll give that to you now. So if timing is a real issue for you, then my suggestion would be that you do the exam in the following order. So you start with question 3A, then do 3B, then do 3C, then do 3D, then do question 2, then do question 1. But only do that if you're struggling with timing. If not, just work through it chronologically. There'll be attached in the description as well, there'll be a Dropbox link to some practice questions as well. Okay, so let's start with number 1 then. So for question number 1, you'll be given a source. This was just taken from one of the past papers online. And you'll be asked to read through the source and then to give 2 things that you can infer. So in this case, it's give 2 things you can infer from source A about the success of the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936. To get the marks on this question, you need to give 2 inferences and then 2 supporting details. Essentially, complete the table that they've given you. Now, an inference means to work something out, and that needs to be a theme. So I always say to students, think of a teacher who comes in and is very angry and is shouting at a student, slams his fist on the desk. If I said to you, what can you infer from that teacher? An inference would be, I can infer that they have issues with their anger. Okay, that might be your inference. You then need to give details. So details means evidence. Okay, so that means a quote from the passage. So if I go back to my example of the teacher, I would be saying I can infer that they have anger issues. Details that tell me this is the fact that they have slammed their fist onto the table. Okay, so don't get that twisted. Your inference needs to be what you can work out, what you can understand, and then the details in the source needs to be your evidence. In this case, you need to pick a quote from the source, which was on the previous slide. Okay, and as you can see, this is the mark scheme. So you are given 1 mark for each valid inference, and then a second mark for a supporting detail. The key thing is your inferences need to be different as well. So if you're just basically kind of giving the same inference but worded slightly differently, you will only get 2 out of 4. Okay, so to get the 4 out of 4, your inferences need to be different. I think question 1 is quite a nice question, so I would recommend practicing it a little bit, but your focus wants to be probably on the other questions, which are far harder. Question 2 is one which we've seen quite a few times, so the explain why 12 marker, and they will always give you 2 stimulus points. I would use the ones that they're giving you here, and then you need to come up with your own argument as well. So this one is explain why the Nazis were able to reduce unemployment in Germany in the years 1933 to 39, and it's giving you some options there to talk about. So essentially, we teach you that you need to write 3 peel paragraphs. Your point sentence needs to closely use the wording of the question. So in this case, you want to start by saying 1 reason the Nazis were able to reduce employment was because of, or the Nazis were able to reduce unemployment due to. So it needs to use the wording of the question. Your evidence then needs to be 2 to 3 pieces of clear and specific evidence. So the use of names, the use of dates, use of key statistics. Okay, if you want to get the highest possible marks. If you are vague with your evidence and you only include 1 or 2 pieces, then you're not going to be able to get into level 4 for this question. And the explanation, you need to have at least 2 sentences minimum, which is directly addressing the question. Again, use the wording of the question as well. So start by saying, as a result of X, this helped to reduce unemployment because. So use sophisticated phrasing, sophisticated connectives as well. So without such and such, it would have been impossible for those kind of phrases. All right, or this strongly contributed to the reduction of unemployment in Nazi Germany because. All right, and that just will make your answer stand. Then we get on to question 3A. This is where it starts to get a little bit trickier. So you'll be given 2 sources, and an image source and then a written source. Now the question will be, how useful are sources B and C? So for this one, is how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the challenges facing the Weimar Republic? This will be included as an insert. So you need to look for a booklet inside your exam paper to find these sources. Okay, so it's really important that you obviously have that in front of you. To get the marks, this is the success criteria. So you want to write a separate paragraph just about source B and a separate paragraph about source C. And you can do a conclusion if you want to, but you don't need to compare the sources. You're not going to be awarded more marks if you're comparing sources. What I would be doing is I would potentially just focus on source B, just focus on source C, and then have a very small conclusion saying overall source B is quite useful or largely useful for this reason. Source C is quite useful for this reason, but there's no need for a comparison. The best answers for these questions will also use sophisticated phrasing. So they're not just going to say, they've got to deal with that how useful part. They're not just going to say, oh yeah, the sources are useful. You need to really think about it. Are the sources incredibly useful? Are they partially useful? Think about it in those terms. So this is the structure that we teach you for these questions, for the how useful questions. So we teach you COPE structure. Other schools teach 4 C's. It doesn't really matter. Okay, COPE is probably the best one. So this is basically how you kind of need to approach the source. First of all, you need to look at the content of the source. So what can you see essentially? If it's an image, you need to pick out something you can see, be specific. So you say, in the foreground of the image, I can see. And then you need to link back to the question. So you could have talked about, in the foreground, I can see soldiers, and this tells me that the Weimar Republic faced a military challenge from the Kapp Putsch. Full stop. Okay, that's how you could approach that. If it's a passage, you then need to select a quotation and then do the same thing. Okay, so you need to pick a quote and then tell me how that tells you, in this case, how does that actually tell us about the challenges faced by the Weimar Republic. So you could pick the bit where it talks about, I think it's talking about printing lots of money, and obviously that's referring to hyperinflation. So you could then talk about how that economic issues were a problem for the Weimar Republic. The second thing you need to do, remember you're doing one paragraph separately on each source. The second thing you need to do in both paragraphs is you need to link to your own knowledge. So you need to identify whether the source matches with your own knowledge or not. So you will say, this source is further useful because it matches strongly with my own knowledge. For example, I know about the Kapp Putsch, and then you tell me what you know. Okay, and it needs to be stuff that's relevant. So you don't need to tell me the whole story of the Kapp Putsch, but you can say, for example, I know that the Kapp Putsch made use of military force from the support of the Freikorps. Okay, that is specific and it's relevant to what the source is saying. All right, you don't need to be telling me about Wolfgang Kapp's childhood. Not relevant to the question. Not relevant to your answer. Okay, so that's your own knowledge. If it matches up with your own knowledge, that means the source is going to be pretty useful. And you'll need to say that in your evaluate section, which I'll go through in a second. Your provenance, that's where you need to think about the nature, origin, or purpose of the source. You don't need to do all 3. You just need to consider one out of those 3. So nature means the type of source. So on the previous slide we had a photo. Okay, is a photo helpful? Is it not helpful? You need to think. You need to make your mind up on that. You need to think about where has the source come from. So its origin. So if it's a source, let's say it's a source actually created by Wolfgang Kapp, is that going to tell us, might that exaggerate the level of threat to the Weimar Republic? Is it telling us how much of a challenge from across German society the Weimar Republic faces? Probably not, because he's obviously going to be trying to play up the threat that he's posing. Okay, and then you need to think about the purpose of the source. Is the purpose of the source to inform? Is it to entertain? Is it to educate? What is the purpose? Obviously, if it's to entertain, then it's not going to be as helpful as if it's to educate. So you need to think about at least one of those 3 for provenance. All right, at least one. If you can do more than one, great, but timing will probably be an issue. So I'll just stick to one. And then finally, you need to evaluate. So based on the content, own knowledge, and provenance, you need to tell me whether you think the source is useful or not. Try to use phrases like partly useful or extremely useful. Okay, so qualify what you're saying. The sources are going to be very important as well later on when we look at question 3C. So I'll come back to that. But this is the mark scheme. So as you can see in band 3 or level 3, to get 6 to 8 marks, judgments on source utility for the specified inquiry are given. So that basically means you're telling me whether you believe the source is useful or not. You take into account how the provenance, so think about nature, origin, and purpose, affects the usefulness. The sources are then analysed, so that's where you're picking out your content. And then the key part is where it says contextual knowledge is used. All right. If you don't use contextual knowledge, then you cannot get into the top band. Same thing as well, if you're not considering the provenance, you're not going to be able to get into the top band. Okay, so you need to follow the structure to the T, or else you are going to be capped. Even if your answer is great, you're going to be struggling to get up to a 6 out of 8. Okay, it's not really going to happen. Okay, 3B, and this is where it deviates from other papers. So you'll be given 2 historians' interpretations. So interpretations 1 and 2, and hopefully don't think I've put those on the slides. I might be able to link them down below. If not, you can always pull up the past paper online and find them. Essentially, you'll be given 2 interpretations, and it will say they give different views about the challenges facing the Weimar Republic in the years 1919 to 1923. It'll say what's the main difference. To do this question, you need to do the following thing. First of all, you need to start with a point sentence. Okay, so you need to identify a difference. So you say the main difference between interpretations 1 and 2 is, and you put the difference. That should just be one short sentence. Okay, so from memory, the interpretations they give you, one of them is talking about hyperinflation, the other one is talking about political challenges from the left and the right. So you would say a main difference between interpretations 1 and 2 is that they place emphasis on different threats to the Weimar Republic. Then you would say, you'd give evidence from interpretation 1. So you say, for example, interpretation 1 says, and you quote it, and you say this suggests, you give the quote. So you say, for example, interpretation 1 believes that. Give the quote and briefly say what that suggests. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but one of the interpretations, like I said, was talking about political opposition. So you say, for example, interpretation 1 believes that political opposition was the biggest threat to the Weimar Republic. It says this in, and then you quote it. Then you do the same from interpretation 2. So again, give me a quote from interpretation 2, what that quote suggests. And then finally, briefly, just one sentence at the end. Therefore, the 2 interpretations differ because, okay? And you can talk about how they're placing emphasis on different threats, all right, to the Weimar Republic. Now, that's just an example. But essentially, this is what the mark scheme looks like. So to get three or four marks, you have to identify a difference between the 2 interpretations. You have to make sure that difference is supported. So look at the word where it says supported. That means you need to give a quote. And then it says the interpretations are analysed. Okay, so that basically means you need to briefly explain what the difference is. All right, if you're not doing that, then you're not going to get a 3 out of 4. A 3 or 4 on this question. Then you're going to come on to question 3C. All right, it says, suggest one reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about the challenges facing the Weimar Republic. You may use sources B and C to help explain your answer. For this one, you need to, no matter what the question, you start with the same point sentence, which is what we teach you. So you start by saying, one reason the 2 interpretations have different views is because they've used different sources as evidence. Okay, no matter what, you use that. All right, so I would just copy that down right now and make sure that you've got it to hand, because that will get you 1 mark. All right, on all the past papers that has worked. You then focus on interpretation 1, and you need to link interpretation 1 to one of the sources. So if you remember for question 3A, we looked at 2 sources. We looked at the soldiers who were part of the Cap Putsch, and then there was a passage about hyperinflation. You would need to link the interpretation 1 to one of those sources. Okay, so you say the author of interpretation 1 has clearly used sources such as source A, which shows I think interpretation 1 was about hyperinflation. So you say, for example, the author of interpretation 1 has clearly used source B or source C, whatever it was, which is about the damaging impact of hyperinflation. In contrast, the author of interpretation 2 is more likely to have used source A or source B. I can't remember whether it was source A or source B, which is an image of soldiers in the Cap Putsch, which suggests or which conveys the military threat posed to the Weimar Republic. And then you just explain why that would lead to a different overall interpretation. Okay, so we said they're different because they're clearly relying upon different sources, and that will ultimately influence their opinion. All right. So as you can see here, the mark scheme says An explanation of a reason for difference is given. So you're not only giving a reason for difference, but you're then explaining how that would lead to a difference. Okay, analyzing the interpretations. The explanation is substantiated effectively. So you really need to think about, if someone is using sources which are playing up the threats by political opposition, why would that mean they don't see hyperinflation as much of a threat? All right, that's the example here. Okay, and the bit I want to focus on now is the hardest question, so question 3D, and it'll be asked you, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the challenges facing the Weimar Republic in the years 1919 to 1923? Okay, this is quite a difficult question, so it is 16 marks, and there's also going to be SPAG assessed as well, so it's technically out of 20. There's 16 marks for your quality of your answer and 4 marks for SPAG. So this is how we recommend you approach it. So you have a very brief introduction stating whether you agree more with interpretation 2 or 1 and why. That's the key thing that a lot of students forget. For the 16 marker, you have to be focusing on both interpretations. I know it only says how far do you agree with interpretation 2. You've got to focus on interpretation 2 and interpretation 1. Okay. First paragraph is what is known as a PCAL. So for that, you need to start off by, so you've done your intro, you're now working on paragraph 1. You would then say, you start with a point sentence, you say, what is interpretation 2 arguing? And then restate your overall argument. I'll show you an example in a second. You then need to give some evidence. So that needs to be a quote. If you do not quote the interpretations, you are capped at, I think it's something ridiculous, like 6 out of 16. If you don't give any quotes at all. And for the highest marks, try and focus on the language and tone of the interpretation as well, if you can. You then briefly explain how the quote you've selected supports interpretation 2's overall point. Okay, that should literally just be 1 sentence, maybe 2 at most. Then what we suggest is you include 2 pieces of your own knowledge to support the claim made by interpretation 2. Okay, so that needs to be specific, and you then need to explain how that supports the interpretation. And then the most important part is the analysis. So if you agree with interpretation 2, you need to say why interpretation 2 is more important than interpretation 1. Okay, if you disagree with interpretation 2 and you think interpretation 1 is stronger, then you need to use some of your own knowledge to explain why that interpretation is wrong. All right, and again, I'll show you some examples of that in a second. And then ultimately, for your link part, you then restate your overall argument and opinion on the strength of the second interpretation. For paragraph 2, you need to do the exact same thing. So follow the PCAL structure again. I would really be making a kind of strong recommendation that you are memorizing the PCAL structure and what's on this screen. But your PCAL in paragraph 2 should be about interpretation 1. Okay. And again, the key part is when you get to your analysis. If you have time, then do a third paragraph. So if you have time, go back to either interpretation 1 or 2, whichever you agree with most, and write another PCAL paragraph on it. But for your evidence, focus on a different quotation. And then your paragraph will be slightly different. And when you're giving your own knowledge, you can give in different bits of own knowledge. But for now, obviously when we get to summer, we're going to be aiming for an intro, 3 paragraphs and a conclusion. But for now, I would be definitely just doing an intro, paragraph 1, paragraph 2, and if I have time, I do paragraph 3. And then ultimately, you have to finish with a conclusion. So you need to tell me which interpretation is more convincing and why, and you need to link back to the overall question. So how far do you agree with interpretation 2? So to help you, I've done examples of the PCAL structure. Okay. Before I put the model answer on, obviously before I'd written this, I would have done an introduction. Okay, it would have been very brief. It would have been something like, overall, I generally agree with interpretation 2 when considering the biggest problems facing the Weimar Republic, and I would have given a reason. Okay, I think my reasoning was because the hyperinflation was something which affected everyone in Germany, and therefore it would have provided a bigger threat, a bigger challenge to the Weimar Republic, as it would have made everyone angry, whereas political opposition didn't make everyone as angry. Okay. As I said earlier as well, we'll try and drop these interpretations in a Dropbox link for you to download, so that you can have them alongside whilst you're looking through the video. Okay, so this is the model answer. Pause the video now, and I would try, if I were you, to try and highlight where have I done my point, where have I done my evidence, where have I done my explanation, where have I included my own knowledge, where have I analysed and said which interpretation, and said whether I think interpretation 2 is better than interpretation 1 or not, and where have I linked back to the question. Okay, do that for me now. Okay, so hopefully you've paused and kind of now you've resumed and you've reached a similar conclusion. So the part in red is my point, the part in blue is my evidence, my explanation, as you can see, is in brown, it's quite short. The biggest things though is the purple part, which is my own knowledge. So 2 pieces of specific own knowledge, so I'm using specific statistics. So 200 billion marks in November 1923, that's specific. I'm explaining that, so I'm then saying this ruined the lives of German people as they were struggling to cover the costs. And then I've then talked about the Munich Putsch, and how that was caused by the hyperinflation crisis. I've then moved on to my analysis, and I'm arguing that interpretation 2 is better than interpretation 1 into the challenges when looking at the challenges faced by the Weimar Republic, as hyperinflation was a phenomenon which affected everyone in German society and made them all angry towards the Weimar government. In contrast, extreme political parties had a small membership, and so it only reveals that some people were angry towards the Weimar government, which means it poses less of a threat. Okay, so that's my analysis. All right, and I'm thinking the fact that hyperinflation affects everyone. And then I've put, I therefore agree to a large extent. Okay, so that would be my first paragraph. The second paragraph I'll show you is one that I wrote with students in a revision session. So I can't remember off the top of my head if it's as good a standard as this one, but I would basically be pausing this and trying to use this as your example for the structure. Now, because I'm arguing that in my essay that interpretation 2 is stronger than interpretation 1, in my second paragraph, when I look at interpretation 1, I need to, when I'm doing my analysis, try and say why interpretation 1 is not as helpful as interpretation 2. So the rest of my answer will stay the same. The rest of the structure stays the same. I'll do my point, my evidence, explanation, and my own knowledge for interpretation 1. But then it will differ when we get to the analysis towards the end, and I'll show you that now. So this is the paragraph I wrote with students. I would just pause the video now and try and identify where have I included the own knowledge and where have I included the analysis. Okay. Finally, this is basically a breakdown. So the own knowledge is from the part which is from my own knowledge, and that goes all the way to the words major threat. So my point, evidence, explain, and own knowledge has stayed the same. What's changed is I've now added this analysis in. So I'm arguing that interpretation 1 is not as convincing as interpretation 2 because I know that the failure of the Kapp putsch was down to the people not supporting Kapp. This suggests that he had little support and meant that political opposition was not a real threat to Ebert. So Ebert is the leader of the Weimar Republic. Therefore, interpretation 1 is less convincing. So my whole argument is that hyperinflation affected everyone, so that means it's going to be a bigger threat because everyone's going to be angry at the Weimar Republic. Whereas political opposition, so the Spartacist uprising and the Kapp putsch, they do have, the Spartacists do have a decent base of support, but they ultimately don't have enough, and the Kapp putsch is kind of falls flat because he's unable to get the support of the workers. All right, and I could have been even more specific when including my own knowledge. I could have said the Kapp putsch because of his right wing, because of the right wing views of Wolfgang Kapp, he was unable to attract the support of the workers, who were more willing to listen to the Weimar Republic, who had fled, and therefore that suggests that the people were more on the side of Ebert than they were on the side of Kapp, and therefore political opposition was not a real threat. Remember, I did write this one in a revision session with students, so I can't remember whether it's of as good a standard as the previous paragraph, but it gives you an idea of how you could approach the argument and the analysis for this part of the exam. All right. Now, the final thing I wanted to say just before I finish the video is talk about timings. So on these papers, we always suggest 1.5 minutes per mark. So if a question is 4 marks, you need to spend 6 minutes on it. If it's 12 marks, spend 18 minutes on it. If it's 8 marks, spend 12 minutes on it. If it's 16 marks, spend 24 minutes on it. All right. So that will cover all the timings that you need for the actual paper. All right. The thing that's going to require most of your attention is this last 16 mark interpretation question. Okay, because it is out of 20. I would be directing all of my focus on that if I was a student. It's the bulk of your marks. If you can do this well, you will be sorted for the whole exam. All right. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you found that helpful, and stay tuned for the next video. I will also be doing videos where I do a walkthrough of exam questions, and I do some model answers live, but that won't be happening for a few months at least. I'm going to be focusing on content before then. Thank you. So here is the mark scheme for the 12 markers. As you can see, there is 6 marks available for AO2, 6 marks available for AO1. So for AO2, it's basically your analysis of second order concepts. What that means in English is how well can you explain, how clear is your analysis and your explanation of your evidence. And then AO1 is your knowledge and understanding of features and characteristics. Basically, how good is your evidence? So are you being specific, or are you being quite vague, quite general? Okay. Again, I don't think question 2 on this paper is too bad. You will have had practice on this in your paper on Elizabeth and in your paper on medicine by this point.